28% of Jamaican women experience direct gender-based violence over a lifetime, and within the year prior to reporting, 7% of women on the island have reported to have experienced abuse from an intimate partner. Good evening, I am Priya Alexander, a researcher here at the Caribbean Policy Research Institute, CAPRI. CAPRI is an independent think tank devoted to evidence-based research towards improved public policy making in Jamaica and the Caribbean. Over our 14 years doing this work, we have undertaken research on the issues that are of most significance to Jamaica and the Caribbean's development. Today, we focus on the issue of gender-based violence and the importance of gender-sensitive reporting in highlighting its seriousness. Welcome to the launch of the report, Breaking News, Gender-Based Violence in Jamaican News Media. This report explores the ways in which gender-based violence, GBV, is reported and represented in traditional media outlets in Jamaica and gives recommendations to promote gender-sensitive reporting in the Jamaican news media, with the ultimate aim to reduce incidence and rate of gender-based violence. This report was made possible with support from the High Commission of Canada. CAPRI researcher Dominic Graham will do a presentation on the findings of this report. A panel discussion will follow, moderated by our Director of Research, Dr. Diana Thorburn, with Dr. Karen Carpenter, a senior lecturer and head of the Institute for Gender and Development Studies, Mona Unit, and Mr. George Davis, the president of the Press Association of Jamaica. We invite our audience to participate in our discussion by using the online platform Slido. Simply browse to slido.com and enter the event code CAPRI. There, you may post your questions, vote up other people's questions, and vote on ongoing polls. We now welcome Dr. Deborah Dupuy-Pinks, representative from the High Commission of Canada, to bring remarks.
Good evening. We gather this evening to listen carefully to the results of this important study and determine where we are now, how we are doing, and where do we need to go. Violence against women and girls occurs within a context of gender inequalities. We cannot speak of reducing violence without examining and seeking to address these inequalities. But the negative consequences of gender inequality impacts all of us. Looking at boys and men and at girls and women and recognizing that these problems have deep historical roots with many intersections, we see that we are all part of the problem, but also the solution. The intersections include the cultural, structural, psychological, and direct physical violence. They are expressed through social norms that support unequal power relations between men and women, including the normative use of violence to resolve conflicts, often exacerbated by emergencies such as the COVID-19 pandemic. This is why attempts to reduce gender-based violence are so difficult to deal with across the world. In June 2017, Canada announced a new feminist international assistance policy which places gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls at the center of our international assistance. The policy clearly aligns with the overwhelming evidence that only through pursuing gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls will the world be able to eradicate poverty and achieve all 17 Sustainable Development Goals, including SDG 5, which is explicitly focused on the structural barriers to equality faced by women and girls. In addition, gender equality is integrated across all other SDG goals and targets, and in our response, all of Canada's international assistance programs requires that gender equality appear in results for every initiative, regardless of sector. Canada's programming globally and here in the Caribbean is committed to addressing the unacceptably high rates of sexual and gender-based violence experienced by women and girls. This includes our global program, Women's Voice and Leadership, represented in the Caribbean, including Jamaica. The Caribbean Project provides funding for 26 women's rights organizations in 8 CARICOM countries to strengthen and support their core programming. This work by Capri and a Jamaica gender assessment being done by the World Bank, along with planned future initiatives, are part of our gender portfolio programming in Jamaica. Our programming explicitly seeks to respond to and support Jamaica's Bureau of Gender Affairs' National Strategic Action Plan for the Reduction of Gender-Based Violence. We are pleased to continue our partnership with the Bureau of Gender Affairs. So, what have we learned through our gender work? We know we still need more services and increased access to them, more education and supportive legislation, and more funding to support women's rights organizations for advocacy efforts. We also need the media to play an informed role in supporting all of the above. Words have influential power, and media holds that power. Together, to achieve gender equality and reduce gender-based violence, we need to strengthen relationships rooted in mutuality, trust, and shared values. We need to include our men and boys in gender work to promote positive male values, which strongly exist, but not always promoted in a positive light. We need to portray and promote our women, girls, boys, and men in balanced and non-stereotypical ways. Words have power. Sharing information, but also building knowledge, is essential to stopping gender-based violence once and for all. In closing, I want to thank Capri for their very good work and the advocacy role that they bring to everything they do. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to insightful presentations and invigorating discussions.
Thank you, Deborah, and welcome to our launch and panel discussion of our report, Breaking News, Gender-Based Violence in the Jamaican Media. Before we get into the panel discussion, we're going to have the presentation of the report by one of the researchers who worked on the report, Dominique Graham. Before we get to the presentation, I'd like to invite people to not only log on to Slido, but to answer the first poll question on Slido, which is, how would you rate the coverage of gender-based violence in Jamaican media? And I hope you'll stick around to answer the second one, because it will be something of a before and after poll. So I'm going to turn over now to Dominique, who is going to introduce the study and share the findings and the results.
Good evening. Welcome to your evening newscast. We have breaking news tonight. Student raped while boyfriend watched. Brute rapes receptionist at law firm. Man allegedly sits on pregnant woman. These are only a few examples of some of the emotion-provoking headlines that cover gender-based violence in Jamaican news media. Jamaica is one of the most violent countries in the world. Gang murders make up the majority of the most extreme violence, but the most vulnerable are also affected, such as children and the elderly. In addition to this, Jamaica has one of the highest rates of violence against women in the world. Gender-based violence, or GBV, is the term used to describe harmful acts directed at an individual based on their gender. That is, they suffer these acts of violence because they are women. GBV is one of the main forms of violence perpetrated against women in Jamaica, with violence against women and girls, or VOG, being the most common of its form, including intimate partner violence. GBV is rooted in gender inequality and gender power imbalances, and while both men and women can be victims of gender-based violence, women and girls are disproportionately impacted. It is estimated that 1 in 4 Jamaican women experience direct gender-based violence over their lifetime. But within the past 12 months, only 7% of Jamaican women reported to have experienced abuse from an intimate partner. There are several causes of gender-based violence, and the confluence of causes is complex, but cultural attitudes have been found to contribute significantly to the scale and nature of violence against women and girls, as well as the reactions and responses to it. Given that there is a proven link between media consumption and cultural attitudes, and with the news media playing a key role in the development and reinforcement of social beliefs, news media actors have a great influence, thus, responsibility, creating the way in which broader society understands and reacts to issues related to violence against women and girls. As such, we set out to better understand how violence against women and girls is represented in Jamaican news media. We analyzed 63 media articles from 4 popular news outlets, we interrogated the Jamaican Journalists' Code of Practice, and we garnered the views and experiences of several local media professionals. Our goal was to find out the potential of applying gender-sensitive reporting as an approach to representing gender-based violence within local media. This was done with an objective of changing societal attitudes so that the general public may be better able to recognize gender-based violence as something that is problematic, be less tolerant of it, and also in hopes of ultimately reducing its incidence and rates within the country. So from our analysis of media content, we arrived at and worked with 3 themes. The first, framing. This has to do with how the media shapes the public's construction of reality. It influences the audience's understanding of what types of behavior constitutes as gender-based violence, who enacts them, who is impacted by them, and how they're responded to. The second, tone. It specifically refers to the way people are prompted to feel about and respond to stories reflecting gender-based violence. And third, silence, referring to the general omission of perspectives, including that of certain voices or of context. With regarding to framing, we noticed that traditional news media, although not often, tend to perpetuate some stereotypes as it regards gender-based violence in their news reporting. For example, throughout our analysis, we found that a number of the reviewed articles highlighted negative stereotypes of perpetrating men by presenting them as individuals who are characteristically sick or bad, disguising the truth that perpetrators of violence against women and girls are regular people. This was also observed in headlines of sampled articles through the use of words such as monster and quotes that perpetuate offender stereotypes, creating a handbook in the minds of readers about which particular individuals are deemed more or less harmful than others. There was also noticeable stereotyping of women victims. Although this was not done like that of typical Western media by focusing on the victim's purity and beauty, it was articulated through the mentioning of the victim's pregnancy and motherhood. In detailing the vulnerability and positive attributes of victims, it dubs them as legitimate, blameless, or otherwise undeserving of being harmed. It gives the reader a toolkit on how to identify or sympathize with a real or an ideal victim based on certain qualities. The hyperfocus on some of the more gruesome forms of GBV was also a prominent observation throughout the sample. Nearly half of the reviewed news articles focused on more morbid cases of murder, rape, and buggery. This disproportionate focus on some of the most shocking forms of GBV demonstrates a lack of consideration in accurately framing the range of this kind of violence, portraying the previously mentioned ones as the only ones worthy of real attention. Regarding tone, several articles were found to casually present crimes committed against women and girls, describing them as incidents or matters. Such passivity was also seen through the use of informal words such as fondled, normalizing the violence enacted on the victims. Evidence of victim blaming was also noted and expressed through the presentation of the victim's behavior in negative tones. Over half of the articles that discussed instances of physical assault, murder, or threats of murder made note of an earlier dispute sometime before or immediately prior to the abuse. These events were presented in a way that indicates a cause-effect relationship between the victim's behavior and the harm caused to them. And finally, silence. The responsibility is on the news media to not only report stories, but also to provide information and analysis that explores the broader societal context in which these stories occur. A number of articles did not seize the opportunity to highlight VOG as a broader issue or link the victimization of individuals to social issues such as economic dependency on a partner. A few also noted negative experiences of disclosing assaults, most notably through the refusal of a health service, potentially discouraging readers from reporting their own abuse. Many also did not provide details of the process of reporting, or details of an organization readers could contact. We therefore sought to ascertain the level of gender-sensitive reporting within local media reports, and what we found was some conflicting evidence. This was done from 3 different angles. 1, through examining the gender representation within the media houses. 2, through noting the training received or willing to be received by journalists. And 3, by analyzing the effectiveness of in-house and national writing guidelines for journalists. Gender-sensitive reporting refers to the practice of producing media content that takes into consideration gender inequalities and attempts to fairly portray women and men. Now, whereas in other countries, equal representation of genders within media houses is directly linked with more gender-sensitive reporting, in Jamaica, this was not so. There's an almost equal distribution of male and female media professionals that are directly involved in journalism across the nation's 4 prominent media houses. However, in Jamaica, gender awareness in reporting is found to be more dependent on the author's social background and understanding, and less so on their gender. While male authors are more likely to cover severe forms of violence against women and girls, engage in victim blaming, and present offenders in a passive manner, female authors more frequently present positive attributes of victims, hinting at the undeserved harm caused, and are less likely to explore the broader societal links related to their victimization. Training on gender-sensitive reporting is available in Jamaica. However, a considerable number of media professionals, particularly the more seasoned ones, express disinterest in or attendance at such training opportunities. The younger journalists who are more gender aware and who are open to improving their writing prefer practical guidance that demonstrates that news professionals should do rather than what they cannot and should not do. 50% of the nation's most prominent news media houses have an in-house code of practice or writing guidelines for their journalists to adhere to. Although these guidelines do not definitively speak to gender-based violence, they do acknowledge writing on matters of crime, discrimination, and how to handle confidential information. In addition, the key national guidance made available to local news media agents, the Jamaican Journalist Code of Practice, does not make explicit reference to gender-sensitive writing or elements associated with gender awareness. Therefore, both internally and at the national level, concepts of gender-sensitive reporting are not explicitly outlined in guidelines for journalists to heed. This demonstrates a lack of recognition of gender-related issues expressed on both scales. Our research led us to recommend the following policy solutions to the gaps identified. 1, the development of gender-sensitive reporting guidelines that are specific to the Jamaican context. This should be developed through multi-stakeholder consultations, including the relevant ministries, departments, and agencies, with reference also being made to international best practice standards, such as the UN guidelines for genders and conflict-sensitive reporting. Since matters of context-sensitive reporting and fair reporting is more of an industry-level responsibility, this action should be the duty of the Press Association of Jamaica. 2, media houses should provide ongoing support and guidance in gender-sensitive reporting. While expertise cannot be brought or developed in-house, media houses may partner with specialist organizations such as women's and criminal justice organizations to meet this objective. And 3, media houses should formalize policies and protocols related to gender-based violence and appropriate sexual conduct within their own organizations. This should be done with reference made to the Sexual Harassment Act of 2021. These policies and protocols should be made readily accessible to all staff and be included in the onboarding process. The expectation is that the practice of sensitivity to gender in the workplace will bleed over into more sensitive reporting. Jamaica has a high rate of incidents in GBV. Media has a crucial role to play in this. It is time for them to accept that responsibility. And that's all the news we have. Off to you, Diana.
Thank you, Dominique. And again, welcome to our panel discussion on the report that we've just launched. Our guest this evening, we couldn't ask for a more ideal panel. We have the representative of the gender and the representative of the press, to put it in a very bad way. Dr. Carpenter is the head of the Institute of Gender and Development Studies at Mona, and Mr. Davis is the president of the Press Association of Jamaica. So I think that they'll be able to bring a very balanced and informed perspective to the discussion. Before we go into the discussion, I want to remind our viewers to participate in the discussion by logging into Slido, slido.com, event code Capri, and there's a poll there, which you can continue to vote on. And there'll be another poll later. And then you can also put your questions in, as well as vote up questions that are already there. So if you see a question that you'd like answered, you can vote it up, and then I will see it at the top of my screen. To start off, I'm going to ask both of you, instead of just giving general remarks, to say from where you sit in the role that you occupy, what does a study like this, how does a study like this inform your work? Karen, I'll start with you.
Well, thank you, Dana. The study itself was both interesting and comprehensive. I was happy to see some of the points that were highlighted, not just the gaps, but the solutions. And it is similar to some work that we've been doing at the Institute for Gender with regard to some news reporting on these incidents. I'm happy that it also zeroed in on some of the issues that we face generally, culturally as a society, such as the stereotyping of men and women, the stereotyping of victim and perpetrator, and the use of language that was quite inappropriate, in my view, in both framing the perpetrator as having committed an incident. No one commits an incident. And framing the victim as somehow being open to this victimization because of the feminine traits, etc. So I think both in terms of language, in terms of the gaps that were identified, and in terms of the work that we have to do, because certainly we have to do the work of sensitizing the media to what exactly is gender-sensitive language.
George, how does a report like this, and this study in particular, inform your work?
Well, thank you, Diana. There are many things to draw from the report. First thing to say is that the report is of the usual, the expected Capri standard, which is high, comprehensive. There were some things that I would have assumed that the assumption was wrong based on the findings of the report. Starting to know that 50% of the media houses surveyed did not have policies on how to report on gender, GBV, and related matters. What I would say is that the study highlights just how difficult a journalist's job is in reporting on these things. And one of the conclusions that the report attempts to draw is to suggest that perhaps the journalists and how they report on these stories, that is the dog, and of course the tail would be the audience consuming these stories. That, you know, the dog wags the tail. But as a practitioner, I can tell you that a lot of the ways in which the stories are crafted and the things that are put into the stories that would flag as problematic in a story like this reflect how the journalists anticipate, based on experience, the public wanting the story to be told, to give as much palatable detail as is possible. And you have to do that as a journalist, and the skill comes in not re-victimizing the victim, being fair and proper in your treatment of minors, and also treating the key actors in the key persons in the story with the kind of respect that prevents persons from knowing who the victim is by identifying who the alleged perpetrator is. So it's a minefield, but I would suggest that the way the reportage is done is based significantly on how the public reasonably expects these stories to be told.
Well, I think in even asking a question, what is a representation? It suggests that there's a one-way street of how these things work. And what you're saying is that actually there's a dynamic between the reporter and the audience, which kind of brings us to the broader question of things like, is it violence in music that affects violent behavior, or is it the music that's reflecting the behavior? So I think we have to then start to ask, where does, or can we even say, where is the line? Where does a reporter's responsibility begin and end? And does the public have a responsibility? I mean, is part of the job educating the public on these things, Karen?
Yes, I'm a little concerned with the notion that the public, the consuming public, always wants a sensational. I'm concerned with the notion, and I'm not saying that's what George is saying today, but I certainly see it in the media reporting, that the more sensational, the better. The more we can stick with the gory details, the better. And there's a notion, I think, in the media houses, both print and broadcast media, that the public actually has an appetite for this kind of reporting. I would suggest that that is not an informed decision, and that if we look at our numbers of non-offending, even male persons in the country, 70% of men are never violent against women. So is that 70% also requiring a horror story when you report on someone's personal tragedy? I think the media needs to update itself on what the public wants. Instead of, I've heard this story for over 20 years, the same story. It's what the public wants. I don't know that that's true.
Well, here's the thing. I can jump right there. Having worked at all levels in a media house, and I'm just restricting it to the radio aspect of my career at Nationwide. I've been reporter, I've been senior reporter, I've been news editor. Here's the thing. So you raise a point of you're not sure that's what the public wants. If it is that there is an incident, and here you go,
yes, my back just went up.
I'm gonna tell you why we say it's an incident. How do you, as a media host, report an allegation of sexual assault? One person the victim, one person the alleged perpetrator. You have to find a way to describe that without doing anything that would cause you to prejudice the person charged or the person accused, doesn't have to be charged yet, the person who is the alleged victim, and the entire way that situation will be handled by law enforcement. So you have to use careful terms so that you don't step on any toes, you don't go out of bounds. And that's why incident is acceptable in the toolkit of the scriptures that journalists have at their disposal. So to the point now, when you have certain matters, and I deliberately use that because the report from Dominique said incident and matters, so reduce it to that. You will have details of what happened. So Karen's station has 2 points of detail. Diana's station has 6 points of detail. In those 6 points, there's nothing in it that a reasonable person could say, well, you've just revealed who the victim was by what you said, or you've just interfered with the police's investigation of the case that they're preparing by virtue of what you said. None of those charges stick. It's just that you have more details. Diana has more details than Karen does. Those who listen to Karen's station, who would have heard that Diana reported so and so and so, will call you, and I've fielded those calls, and not just as the person in charge of the newsroom. As a youngster on the line, I would take those calls sometime. People accuse you of withholding the details. Sir, how did you not say so and so and so and so? And especially in the case where if there's a high-profile Jamaican, high-profile individual involved in something like that, you will be told that, so you and your friends down there are covering up for so-and-so because you don't want to say that happened and that happened and that happened. I'm saying that it is a legitimate argument. And I know Karen says she's heard it over 20 years. Maybe you've been hearing it for 20 years. It has been recurring because it is true. I'm saying that people call newsrooms and demand to know why certain details have been omitted from a report because they're saying we've heard elsewhere that so and so and so and so happened. You chose not to report it. There must be an agenda that you are in furtherance of an agenda why you have chosen not to report. And so again, this is part of what I've said. The way it is reported is to give as much without causing injury, without jeopardizing the police's investigation, without re-victimizing the victim, without passing sentence on the accused before they've had their day in court. It's a difficult thing to navigate all of that and remain on an even keel at the same time.
But I'm just going to go to the question, because this is also a question that I had. Since working on this report, I now read these articles differently. And I had the same question that Mark does. I'm now a little bit, maybe even confused. Like, what are we as the public, we as citizens, we as readers, what's our role in encouraging better reporting, discouraging? How do we, the public, contribute to not solving the problem, but at least trying to do what we ought to do? What ought citizens and regular readers and the public do to contribute to making this a better situation?
Well, I think the person who calls you, as you said, when you were a youth. Okay, George, that was a long time ago.
Not so long.
Who calls you and says, you guys are biased, you're not really reporting the news, etc. I think that the public has a right to call out journalists, media houses, etc. if they feel that is what is happening. It doesn't mean it's true. I also am careful that we don't use a case of one to prove the majority. The person who calls you, 4, 5, 6 persons who call you, are not a majority. So what is the role of the public? I think the public has a right and a role to keep you on your toes. I think if they feel that information is being withheld, certainly they should also ask for it. But I also think that the public needs to speak up when they are disgusted by the reporting, and they'd like decent reporting in terms of protecting and safeguarding people. I don't know if we're aware, because certainly, Diana, having done some of that review of articles only recently, just a couple of weeks ago, I don't know that we're aware of how much detail about the victim is being given in a number of those incidents. So having more information doesn't mean that you have a right to reveal a person's identity. Photographs are included, addresses are included in terms of where the person is located. You know which hospital they went to. It's not difficult to find out who the person is. I don't think that's particularly gender sensitive.
I would say that there's a common joke in certainly the newsroom that I worked in and the one that I work in now, where we say that the public doesn't know that most of the times for a story that is published, that is really like 1/3 of the information that we have. So there is a lot of, there are a lot of responsible journalists working in newsrooms where there's the weight of experience of persons who've done this before, who know how to guide them. Yes, there are a couple that don't meet the threshold of the standard required. But the point is that because people know how to navigate and know how to be sensitive, the first thing you have to ask yourself when reporting something of gender sensitivity where violence is concerned is, are you saying anything that can allow someone to know which child in a community was sexually assaulted? Because you don't want a situation where the child's peers go to the gate and mock that person, because that has happened in the past. Are you treading close to identifying the alleged perpetrator? So they can say, oh, so a mass storm, that means I'm a Cindy. Yeah. So we do the checks for that. And then how many of the details of the incident will we report that a reasonable person would say is unpalatable? No, man, you shouldn't report that. Those are the self-checks that a journalist does. And some people just do it like that. Some people have to consult the guide that exists in the newsroom to say, okay, 1, 2, 3, are these three things okay? Okay, so I can report the rest. So I'm saying deliberate care is taken to ensure that there is fairness, that the information is palatable, but one of the things that I see that we don't do in Jamaica, that I see them do elsewhere. I mean, everybody reads The Guardian these days in the UK. At the end of each article, yeah, and while the Dominique was giving the report, it came to mind that, yeah, that exists. There is this line at the end of every article that says, if you or anyone has been a victim of sexual violence or whatever, please call so and so and so, or visit the website of so and so. I think that should be standard. So coming out of the report, I would take that on as a recommendation, even though it wasn't expressly stated, but the suggestion would lead me to go here. That is one of the things lacking. But I'm saying that journalists take due care, and not because they take due care mean they get it right, because some people conflate the things. And because you are careful, you don't make mistakes. No, but due care is taken, and things like these, studies like these that show the gaps in black and white, can only help to refine the process by which we churn out these stories. And examples of the one I just gave, and to how we can better assist at the end of, it's a radio newscast, you have that line in the story. If it's in print, you have that line at the end. If it's in TV, you put that up on the screen in text with the numbers in bold, the website in bold, or whatever, so that potential victims or persons who know victims can reach out to support services. I think that's a way we can go. That's a direction we can go.
No, I think that's a great idea, and I think that is something that we could have added to our recommendations, and maybe we should, especially now that we have more resources in Jamaica for this kind of reporting and getting this kind of support. Speaking of recommendations, I'm going to go straight to them because I want to hear how you both feel about the 3 recommendations in terms of their feasibility and the potential for these recommendations to make an advance for us to be able to move forward on this issue. So the first one was about guidelines for journalists regarding gender-sensitive reporting that should be developed for the specific Jamaican context, with multi-stakeholder consultations, and that this is an action that should be the responsibility of the Press Association. George, since this is your baby.
Yeah, the thing is this, I take that on because I felt as if, I had let one slip there, because since in my time as president, since 2018 August, we've had several training sessions, several workshops. I hate to call them workshops because I tend to think that we do them different from the traditional workshop. These are different, more intense. But anyway, these workshops, for want of a better descriptor, and never in the brainstorming process have we said, as anybody said in those brainstorming sessions, you know what? Let's do a training on how to report on GBV. And I feel now, looking at the report and all it has served up, as if that was a major failing. So it is needful for us to lead that process and to also lead the creation of a document, a guide, even in the context of the code of practice that exists itself, which we are in the process of revising now, or as a standalone document to guide it. I would take that on wholeheartedly.
Okay.
Wonderful.
Karen, do you think that are these kinds of guidelines useful beyond having them? I mean, do we know that these guidelines make a difference?
I think that we have to have them, whether or not they make a difference. And I do believe that they make a difference if we can. George says that his workshops are very dynamic. If we can do the kind of workshopping that is facilitatory and participatory, that makes people understand what the repercussions of their words on paper. We know you have to make choices. We know that you can't put the whole story there. But if we can show you why it might be advisable to word your story in another way and still contain the facts, then I think that's extremely useful. The other thing that I think is not dovetailing with what's going on in media is that laws are changing. Just a year ago, we had a Sexual Harassment Act passed, and we have to be in step with the law. The law is becoming more gender sensitive. The education in schools, age-friendly curriculum update for GBV inclusion has taken place, and the journalists, the media houses must reflect that as well. And I know certainly with George's stewardship, they will.
May I say just one thing before you come to the issue of recommendations? It slipped me to mention earlier. Thank you for that endorsement. The headlines that were in the presentation that Dominique made and that we've made fleeting reference to, I would suggest to people that that is not a true representation of how the media reports on these things and goes for the sensational. We all know the space is crowded, and the aim of a media house is to get cut through for its headline about a particular story. It's a business. Media, this is not charity. We need to pay to keep the lights on and to keep people in employment. So I would wager that the traditional media houses that we expect a certain standard from, that the most juicy or the more salacious headlines are not from those outlets, and are from the headlines, the juicy ones, are from the red top publications, the tabloid kind of publications, which are very important in any society. I mean, the most widely read newspaper in the entire United Kingdom, 60 million of them, is the Sun. Yeah, the Daily Mail is breathing down their neck. The Guardian and the Observer and the Telegraph and the Times and all of those, the readership for those are way down. But you expect to see stories in the Times that you don't expect to see in the Sun, and you expect the Sun headlines to blare in a way that the other newspapers won't do. So you'll see something in the Star, which is a fantastic publication and a vital part of the Jamaican society, because it reflects so much of how people think and what people want to see and how they want to see it. A Star headline would be different from the headline in the Observer or the Gleaner or the headline on the RGR News website or the Nationwide website or the IRFM website or the Mellow TV website or CVM, as about reporting on the same thing. So you get juicy, you get sensational from the tabloid, from the red top, and you get sober and steady from the other media houses. And Dr. Karen Carpenter shakes her head.
No, George.
Tell me I'm wrong there.
I must be honest with you and say that even in my own recent review of the media houses and what they were putting out, I did not find as great a discrepancy as I had expected between print media, and I have also had to listen to and wade through broadcast media's reporting of femicide, the killing of women, the assault, etc. That was the advertisements themselves were designed, yes, to cut through and get attention, but they were not respectful of what I think is the victim or other victims who would fall into the same category. I think sometimes we lead a little bit towards yes, we have to earn the money, but at what cost? At what cost? And there is no, as you've pointed out, messaging that says in the bottom of the ticker tape, if you are a victim of, know a victim of, please reach out, Rise Life Management, etc., etc. There's no responsible reporting in that way.
So recommendation number 2 is in many ways similar to recommendation number 1, that media houses should provide ongoing support and guidance in gender-sensitive reporting. So I'm going to assume from the previous discussion. The third one, and George, I think this is one you'd probably be best placed to answer, but I'd still like to hear Karen's thought on the proposal that media houses formalize policies and protocols related to gender-based violence and appropriate sexual conduct within their own organizations. How does that work in Jamaica, Karen?
Well, the Bureau of Gender Affairs, as you would know, which is an organ that manages the way in which we interpret the Sexual Harassment Act, for instance. And sexual harassment has to be distinguished from sexual assault, rape, etc. The Bureau of Gender Affairs requires that all institutions, and media houses are institutions, within a year of the passing of the Act, actually put in place a guideline for staff. And every organization in this country ought to, by now, with July 13th coming up, July 13th today. Today is the day on which it becomes a year since the Act was passed. And we are all supposed to submit to the Bureau. And the Bureau also provides training for institutions to craft their own document on how to protect sexual rights within the workplace. So we all have that responsibility at the moment.
So then I suppose the question to you, George, is do you think that something like this would actually make the difference that the recommendation suggests that it would?
Well, it certainly it couldn't harm. It can only help. is the question. And I'll be more positive than that to say I think it is needful. My organization, Sports Vaccine TV, owned by Digicel. So Digicel is a forward-thinking employer. So to Sports Vaccine TV, there is that treatment about the conduct that is expected along the areas among staff, interpersonal, and I'm very happy that that exists. There is perhaps even need to make it more expansive in the wake of what the legislation dictates, as
Yes.
articulated by Dr. Carpenter. Also, I can say I have knowledge that my previous employer, Nationwide Radio, they have that expansive treatment of how relationships are to be conducted and the interpersonal nature of it. A document in Fulsom has two definitions, so let's not confuse people. It has it treated in a substantial way. Comprehensive is the word I'm looking for. So there is progress, and I know that those are not outliers in the broad context. So what I would say is that it can only help, and stronger than that, it is needful that organizations get this done. If staff know how to treat with these kind of situations, and if it's a media house, then ultimately your reporting, it will reflect in your reporting what your own company policy says.
Precisely.
Yeah, I'm going to just wrap up now. And one thing that didn't come out in the presentation, but I think it's important to mention, and picking up on something George just said, is that the report found that there has been an improvement, that all the stakeholders interviewed agreed to one extent or another that there has been improvement in this space, in how gender-based violence is reported and treated in the media. So, we have to recognize that it's not all bad. And I think a lot of the other findings were also very balanced. Some things were better than we expected. Some things were as we expected, and some things were a little worse than we expected. I'm going to give you each a minute to say anything else that we should have said tonight that we haven't said about this topic, about the report, about a call for action.
Well, I think for my part, when I look at what's happening with gender-based violence, both internationally and locally, even regionally, we see a conflation of all types of violence under that label. And I think one of the things that we must be mindful of in gender mainstreaming is that we must disaggregate data. So there is a need for us not only to report on gender-based violence, but to look at the forms in which gender-based violence occurs and to be able to target each type of violence differently. They're not all the same. The perpetrators are not all the same, and the victims are not all the same. So that I hope in another year we'll be sitting here saying that, wow, there's been great improvement. Yes?
Yeah.
George, a last thought about the report or the topic itself?
Yeah, what the report ought to have done, I think, is to ask from the perspective of the consumers of news. How would you like to hear? What is palatable for you in terms of getting a news report about matters of gender-based violence? And I think that would have given a different perspective to some of the points made and made the findings richer than they are.
Yes.
I think so.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Okay. I'd like to remind our viewers to go to Slido and fill out the second poll, which we'll share the results of shortly. I'd like to thank you both for a lively discussion and appreciate you giving your time and your thoughts to this topic. It's not something that is an obvious topic. We realize that, but as the report makes the case for, and I think you two would agree, it's something that's important, especially in the context of Jamaica and its serious violence problem, gender-based violence and violence all around. I'm going to hand back over to Priya to give us some closing remarks.
Davis for joining us and engaging in this enlightening discussion this evening. We also acknowledge and thank our sponsors for their continued support. And thank you, our audience. We have one final request of our audience, and it is to go back to Slido, rate this evening's event. Tonight's report is available on our website at capricaribbean.org. Once again, Thank you for joining us. Have a good night.